The Galactic Council had been testing civilizations for intelligence for approximately 14 billion years, give or take a few cosmic hiccups. They had developed what they considered to be the most sophisticated, foolproof, and utterly brilliant system of evaluation ever conceived, which, as it turned out, was their first mistake. On a particularly mundane Tuesday, if you could call it Tuesday when you existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously, the Council's chief intelligence assessor, a creature named Blorbex, who looked like a cross between a filing cabinet and a very disappointed umbrella, received the most shocking news of his career. "What?" Blorbex's voice echoed through the crystalline chambers of the Council headquarters, causing 3 junior assessors to spontaneously molt. "You're telling me that planet Earth scored 0 on every single intelligence metric we've devised?" His assistant, Grindelwald, a being who resembled a nervous accordion with too many eyes, shuffled his papers anxiously. "Well, sir, not exactly 0. They scored negative points on several categories, particularly in the logical resource management section, where they somehow managed to invent something called planned obsolescence, just to make things break faster." Blorbeck stared at the report with the kind of expression usually reserved for discovering that someone had used your favorite tentacle as a coat hanger. "And the social harmony assessment? They failed that one so spectacularly that our computers assumed there was a calculation error. Apparently, they've divided themselves into groups based on the amount of melanin in their skin, the shape of their reproductive organs, and something called whether pineapple belongs on pizza. The chief assessor's 12 eyes blinked in sequence, creating a disturbing wave effect. Surely their technological advancement shows some promise. Grindelwald's accordion-like form compressed with worry. "Sir, they've invented artificial intelligence that can compose symphonies and diagnose diseases, but they primarily use it to create pictures of cats with poor spelling. Now you might think that any reasonable galactic authority would simply mark Earth as cosmic failure and move on to the next planet. But the Galactic Council had not survived 14 billion years by being reasonable. They had survived by being thoroughly, obsessively, and mind-numbingly bureaucratic. "We need a full assessment team," Blorbex declared, his filing cabinet body creaking with determination. "I want our best evaluators on this. Something doesn't add up." Which brings us to the arrival of Assessment Team Designation Alpha Boring 7, consisting of 3 individuals who would soon discover that the universe had a sense of humor, and it was not a pleasant one. First was Vextala, a being from the Rigel system who prided himself on having catalogued every form of logical thinking in the known universe. He stood 7 feet tall, had skin that looked like polished chrome, and possessed the personality of a particularly pedantic instruction manual. Second was Flibbernut, a creature from the gas giant Wobbleton, whose species had evolved perfect emotional control and social harmony. She appeared as a constantly shifting cloud of pleasant colors and spoke in tones that could calm a supernova. Third was Grozzle, a technological genius from the machine worlds, whose cybernetic implants had replaced so much of his original biology that he was essentially a walking computer with delusions of grandeur. They arrived on Earth, on what humans would later remember as the day all our Wi-Fi started working perfectly for no apparent reason. Their ship, invisible to human detection, settled into orbit with the quiet confidence of beings who had never encountered a species that could surprise them. "Initial scans confirm the preliminary reports," Vextala announced, his voice carrying the enthusiasm of someone reading a tax code. "This species appears to lack even the most basic understanding of efficient resource allocation." Flibbernut's colors shifted to a puzzled mauve. "Their emotional patterns are chaotic. They seem to experience joy and despair simultaneously while consuming something called reality television." Grozzle's optical sensors whirred. "And their technology. They've created global communication networks that they use primarily to share images of their food and argue about things that happened centuries ago." The three aliens exchanged what, in their respective cultures, passed for expressions of professional disdain. They had seen primitive civilizations before, but this was something else entirely. "Let's begin the standard evaluation protocol," Vextala said, pulling out a device that looked like a clipboard had been traumatized by a mathematics textbook. "We'll start with the basic logic assessment. Down on Earth, in the small town of Millbrook, population 2847, something very interesting was happening, or rather something very uninteresting was happening in a very interesting way. Professor Wimbledon Crackerjack, and yes, that was his actual name, which his parents had given him in a moment of what could only be described as prophetic cruelty, was sitting in his laboratory, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold approximately 3 hours ago. Crackerjack was the kind of person who looked like he had been assembled from spare parts of other more successful people. His hair pointed in directions that defied several laws of physics. His glasses were held together with what appeared to be hope and electrical tape, and his laboratory coat bore stains that told the story of 1,000 failed experiments. "Bloody hell!" he suddenly exclaimed, jumping up so quickly that he knocked over a stack of papers, 2 empty pizza boxes, and what might have been a prototype for a time machine. "The electromagnetic readings are off the charts." His assistant, a woman named Prudence Wicklebottom, who had the remarkable ability to remain calm while chaos erupted around her, looked up from her own work. "What kind of off the charts, Professor? The we're all going to die kind, or the something interesting is happening kind?" "The something is watching us kind," Crackerjack replied, his eyes wide with excitement. "There's a massive artificial construct in orbit, and it's been there for exactly," he consulted his instruments, 17 minutes and 43 seconds. Prudence raised an eyebrow. "And how exactly do you know it's artificial?" "Because it's emitting a signal that's essentially saying, 'Hello, we're here to test your intelligence. Please don't mind us,' in 17 different languages, including some that sound like they were invented by a committee of depressed mathematicians." Up in orbit, Vextalar was conducting his first assessment. He had chosen to evaluate humanity's problem-solving capabilities by observing their response to a simple scenario: a traffic jam. "Fascinating," he murmured, watching through his advanced sensors as thousands of humans sat in their metal transportation devices, going absolutely nowhere. "They've created a system of personal vehicles that regularly prevents them from reaching their destinations." "Wait, surely this must be some form of meditation ritual," Flibbernut suggested, her colors shifting to a hopeful turquoise. "Or perhaps a test of patience," Grosel added, his mechanical voice carrying a note of admiration. "They're maintaining perfect formation while achieving 0 forward progress." Vextala made a note on his cosmic clipboard. "Humans appear to have invented the concept of voluntary imprisonment." But down in Millbrook, Professor Crackerjack was having thoughts that would have made the alien observers considerably less comfortable if they had been able to hear them. "Prudence, my dear, I think we're being studied," he said, his voice carrying the kind of excitement usually reserved for children on Christmas morning, or scientists who had just discovered something that would either save the world or destroy it entirely. "Studied by whom?" Prudence asked, though she had the distinct feeling she didn't want to know the answer. "By beings who are apparently using technology that's about as subtle as a rhinoceros playing the bagpipes," Crackerjack replied, gesturing wildly at his instruments. "They're scanning our entire planet with sensors that are so advanced they're actually causing measurable distortions in local space-time." He paused, his expression shifting to something that might have been described as maniacally thoughtful. "You know what this means, don't you? That we're about to become the subject of some very unpleasant experiments?" "No!" Crackerjack exclaimed, his hair seeming to become even more disheveled with excitement. "It means we get to study them." While Professor Crackerjack was having this revelation, the alien assessment team was moving on to their next test: social harmony evaluation. They had chosen to observe what humans called a city council meeting in downtown Millbrook. This should be instructive, Vextala noted, settling in to watch what he assumed would be a display of organized, logical decision-making. What they witnessed instead was something that would have made a philosophy professor weep and a chaos theorist applaud. The meeting, which was supposed to address the simple question of whether to install a new traffic light, had somehow devolved into a heated debate about the cultural implications of synchronized swimming, the moral authority of parking meters, and whether the local library's decision to stock books about gardening constituted a form of agricultural propaganda. This is... Flibbernut's colors shifted through several shades of bewilderment. I don't have words for what this is. It's like watching entropy achieve consciousness, Grozzel observed, his mechanical voice carrying a note of what might have been respect. Vextala was frantically taking notes. They appear to have developed a form of collective decision-making that actually generates more confusion than clarity. It's mathematically impossible, yet here we are. The meeting reached its climax when Mrs. Gertrude Bumpernickel, a woman who had strong opinions about everything and the voice to express them, stood up and declared, "I don't care what anyone says, that traffic light is a communist plot to control our driving patterns." The room erupted in a cacophony of voices that sounded like a convention of very angry parrots arguing about the nature of existence. "Remarkable," Vextala murmured. "They've created a system where individuals can express completely contradictory viewpoints simultaneously without the fabric of society collapsing. Is that supposed to be good?" Flibbernut asked, her colors now cycling through what could only be described as existential crisis rainbow. "I'm not sure," Vextala admitted. "Our evaluation protocols don't account for this level of creative dysfunction." Meanwhile, back in his laboratory, Professor Crackerjack was making discoveries that would have given the aliens considerably more to worry about if they had known about them. "Prudence!" he called out, his voice muffled by the fact that he was currently upside down, examining what appeared to be a piece of alien technology that had somehow materialized in his laboratory. "I think I've figured out how their scanning system works." "Should I be concerned that you're examining potentially dangerous alien technology while hanging upside down from the ceiling?" Prudence asked, not looking up from her own work. "Only if you're worried about the possibility of accidentally creating a device that could rewrite the fundamental laws of physics," Crackerjack replied cheerfully, "which, statistically speaking, happens to me about once every third Thursday." He righted himself and held up what looked like a metallic sphere covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly. "This little beauty appears to be some kind of quantum sensor array. Probably dropped it while they were calibrating their scanning equipment. And you can understand how it works?" "Oh, absolutely not," Crackerjack said, with the kind of honesty that was either refreshing or terrifying, depending on your perspective. "But I can certainly figure out how to make it do things it's not supposed to do." Up in orbit, the alien assessment team was beginning their third evaluation, technological sophistication assessment. They had chosen to observe humanity's greatest technological achievement, which, according to their preliminary scans, appeared to be something called the Internet. "This is promising," Grozzel announced, his mechanical voice carrying the first note of optimism they had heard from him. "A global information network that connects every individual on the planet." "Finally," Vextala said, his chrome skin reflecting his relief. "Something that makes sense." They began monitoring the flow of information through this remarkable network, expecting to find evidence of advanced scientific collaboration, philosophical discourse, and the kind of logical data exchange that would indicate a truly intelligent species. What they found instead was something that would haunt their digital dreams for the rest of their existence. "They're using it to share images of cats," Flibbernut observed, her colors shifting to a shade of disbelief that didn't exist in most color spectrums. "Not just cats," Grozzel corrected, his sensors working overtime to process what he was seeing. "Cats with captions, cats with poor spelling, cats expressing human emotions through facial expressions that cats don't actually make. "And they're arguing," Vextala noted, his cosmic clipboard trembling slightly in his hands. "They're arguing about everything. Whether the earth is flat, whether birds are real, whether a hot dog is a sandwich." "What's a hot dog?" Flibbernut asked. "I'm not entirely sure," Vextala admitted, "but apparently it's very important to determine its sandwich status." The assessment team watched in growing horror as humanity's greatest technological achievement revealed itself to be a vast network designed primarily for the dissemination of misinformation, cat videos, and arguments about the appropriate way to hang toilet paper. "This is impossible," Groszel muttered, his mechanical voice carrying the strain of a computer trying to process paradoxical information. "They've created a system that could revolutionize galactic communication, and they're using it to argue about whether pineapple belongs on pizza." "What's pizza?" Flibbernut asked. "I'm afraid to find out," Vextala replied. But while the aliens were struggling to understand the bizarre contradictions of human civilization, Professor Crackerjack was having the time of his life. He had managed to not only reverse engineer the alien scanning technology, but had actually improved upon it. "Prudence, you're not going to believe this," he said, his voice containing the kind of glee usually reserved for children who had just discovered they could make rude noises with their armpits. "Are you about to tell me that you've accidentally started an intergalactic war?" Prudence asked, still maintaining her remarkable composure. "Quite the opposite, actually. I've been listening to their communications, and it turns out they're here to give us some kind of intelligence test." Prudence finally looked up from her work. "And that's good news because they're failing it more spectacularly than we are," Crackerjack exclaimed, doing a little dance that might have been impressive if it hadn't involved accidentally knocking over a shelf of beakers. "They're trying to evaluate our intelligence using criteria that they don't even understand themselves." He gestured wildly at the array of monitors he had set up around his laboratory. "Look at this. They're analyzing our traffic patterns and concluding that we enjoy being stuck in metal boxes. They're watching city council meetings and thinking we've developed some kind of advanced chaos management system. They're examining the internet and apparently having some kind of collective nervous breakdown. So what you're saying is that we're being judged by beings who are even more confused than we are." "Exactly!" Crackerjack shouted, his enthusiasm reaching levels that probably violated several noise ordinances. "And the best part is, they don't even realize that we know they're here." This was, in fact, the moment when the balance of the universe shifted slightly. Not in any dramatic explosions and special effects way, but in the quiet, subtle manner of an accountant discovering that someone had been miscounting the cosmic books for several billion years. The alien assessment team, blissfully unaware that they were being assessed by the very beings they were trying to evaluate, continued their work with the kind of determination that had made the Galactic Council the most bureaucratically efficient organization in 17 galaxies. "Let's try a different approach," Vextala suggested, his chrome skin dulling slightly with what might have been fatigue. "Perhaps we should evaluate their response to a direct stimulus." "What kind of stimulus?" Flibbernut asked, her colors now permanently stuck in confused beige. "Something simple, something that any intelligent species would recognize as significant." Groszel's optical sensors brightened. "I could broadcast a mathematical sequence. Prime numbers, perhaps, or the Fibonacci sequence." "Excellent," Vextala agreed. "Something that would immediately identify us as an intelligent presence." So they began broadcasting a series of prime numbers directly into Earth's communication networks, confident that any truly intelligent species would recognize the pattern and respond appropriately. The response was immediate and comprehensive. Within minutes, every mathematician, physicist, and computer scientist on Earth had detected the signal. Within hours, they had analyzed it, understood its significance, and reached a consensus about its meaning. Within days, they had completely ignored it in favor of arguing about whether the aliens were trying to communicate the recipe for their version of pizza. "This is unprecedented," Vextala muttered, staring at the flood of responses that had nothing to do with mathematics and everything to do with humanity's infinite capacity for creative misinterpretation. "They've received our signal," Flibbernut observed, her colors shifting to a worried purple. "They've analyzed it correctly. They understand that it's a message from an intelligent species. And then they've decided to debate whether we're trying to share cooking instructions," Grozzle added, his mechanical voice carrying the strain of a computer trying to process illogical data. Down in Millbrook, Professor Crackerjack was practically vibrating with excitement. "They're trying to establish first contact using prime numbers. How wonderfully unoriginal." "I take it this is somehow good news?" Prudence asked, though she had learned to be wary of any situation that made the professor this enthusiastic. "Oh, it's magnificent news," Crackerjack replied, his hair now defying several additional laws of physics. "They're using the most predictable, obvious, and boring method of first contact ever conceived. It's like they've read every science fiction novel ever written and decided to follow the script exactly." He gestured at his monitors, which were now displaying what appeared to be a complete analysis of the alien ship's technology. "While they're busy trying to impress us with their mathematical prowess, I've been mapping their entire technological infrastructure. Their computers, their communication systems, their navigation equipment. It's all interconnected, and it's all accessible." "Accessible how?" "Through the same signal they're using to broadcast prime numbers. They've essentially given us a direct line into their entire ship's computer system." Prudence finally allowed herself to look concerned. "And what exactly are you planning to do with this access?" Crackerjack's grin widened to proportions that might have been medically dangerous. "Why, I'm going to give them exactly what they want, of course. I'm going to show them just how intelligent humanity really is." The next phase of the assessment began 3 days later, when the aliens decided that humanity's failure to respond appropriately to prime numbers indicated a need for more direct intervention. "We need to make physical contact," Vextala decided, his cosmic clipboard now bearing the kind of notes that would have made a psychiatric evaluation form look cheerful. "Perhaps direct observation will yield better results." "Are you sure that's wise?" Flibbernut asked, her colors now cycling through what could only be described as rainbow of anxiety. "We're trained assessment specialists," Vextala replied, with the kind of confidence that usually preceded historically significant mistakes. "We've evaluated hundreds of species. What could possibly go wrong?" The answer to that question came approximately 4 minutes after they materialized in Professor Crackerjack's laboratory, using what they believed to be perfectly concealed holographic disguises. "Good afternoon," Professor Crackerjack said cheerfully, not looking up from his work. "You must be the intelligence assessment team from the Galactic Council. Tea? Coffee? I've got some biscuits somewhere, though I should warn you that they've been sitting out since Tuesday." The 3 aliens froze in the kind of complete stillness that usually preceded either enlightenment or total system failure. "How?" Vextala began, his voice carrying the tone of someone who had just discovered that their entire worldview had been constructed from material that was significantly less stable than they had previously believed. "How do I know who you are?" Crackerjack asked, finally looking up from his instruments. "Well, that's quite a story, actually. Would you like the short version or the long version?" "The short version," Grozzle managed, his mechanical voice carrying the strain of a computer trying to process paradoxical information. "You've been broadcasting your assessment protocols on an unencrypted frequency for the past 6 days, Crackerjack said matter-of-factly. "Also, your holographic disguises are calibrated for species with visual systems that are approximately 40% less sophisticated than ours. You look like humans, but humans who have been assembled by someone who has heard humans described, but never actually seen one." He gestured at Vextala, whose disguise made him appear to be a human with an unusually geometric head. Also, you keep taking notes on a clipboard that appears to be made of crystallized light, which is something of a giveaway. Flibbernut's colors shifted to what could only be described as transparent panic. But our assessment protocols are classified at the highest levels of galactic security. Were classified, Crackerjack corrected gently. I'm afraid your security measures are based on the assumption that the species you're evaluating won't be capable of reverse engineering your technology while you're using it to evaluate them. Prudence, who had been watching this exchange with the kind of calm attention she usually reserved for natural disasters, finally spoke up. Professor, perhaps you should tell them about the other thing. What other thing? Vextella asked, though his voice suggested he really didn't want to know. Crackerjack's grin widened. Oh, the part where I've been monitoring the Galactic Council's communications for the past 3 days and discovered that your entire organization is essentially a cosmic bureaucracy that's been evaluating species based on criteria that were written by a committee that disbanded several billion years ago. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that usually preceded either revelation or revolution. That's impossible, Grozzel said, his mechanical voice carrying the tone of someone who was beginning to suspect that the impossible might be significantly more common than he had previously believed. I'm afraid it's not only possible, it's documented, Crackerjack replied, pulling up a holographic display that showed what appeared to be the entire organizational structure of the Galactic Council. Your assessment protocols haven't been updated since the great cosmic reorganization of 7 billion years ago. You've been evaluating species based on intelligence criteria that were designed for a universe that no longer exists. He paused, his expression shifting to something that might have been sympathetic if it hadn't been so thoroughly amused. Also, and I hope you won't take this the wrong way, but your own species failed the intelligence requirements for council membership by a significant margin. You're essentially a collection of beings who weren't smart enough to join the club, but were persistent enough to convince everyone that you were qualified to decide who else could join. This was the moment when the assessment team realized that they had made what experts in cosmic irony would later describe as a fundamental error in basic assumptions. But, Flibbernut began, her colors now cycling through shades that didn't exist in any known spectrum. If we're not qualified to assess intelligence and the assessment protocols are obsolete, then what exactly have we been doing for the past several billion years? Creating the most elaborate, inefficient, and ultimately pointless bureaucracy in the history of the universe, Crackerjack replied, with the kind of cheerfulness usually reserved for people delivering good news. Congratulations, you've achieved something that no other species has ever managed. You've made paperwork a cosmic force. Vextella stared at his crystallized light clipboard with the expression of someone who had just discovered that their life's work had been an elaborate practical joke played by the universe itself. So what happens now? He asked, his voice carrying the tone of someone who had just realized that they were about to become either unemployed or the subject of a very awkward conversation with their superiors. Now, Crackerjack said, his eyes sparkling with the kind of mischief that had probably been responsible for several historical incidents that no one liked to talk about. We have some fun. The fun, as it turned out, involved Professor Crackerjack demonstrating exactly how creative human intelligence could be when properly motivated. Over the next several hours, he proceeded to, first, hack into the Galactic Council's central database and discover that the entire organization was run by an artificial intelligence that had been designed to manage cosmic bureaucracy, but had gradually evolved into something that resembled a very depressed and overly complicated filing system. Second, trace the origins of the intelligence assessment protocols back to their original creators, a species called the primordial assessors, who had apparently designed the tests as a joke before transcending to a higher dimension and leaving behind only a note that read, Sorry about the paperwork. Good luck figuring out what intelligence actually means. The management. Third, discover that the majority of species in the galaxy had been classified as insufficiently intelligent, not because they actually lacked intelligence, but because they had been too smart to take the assessment tests seriously. And fourth, realize that humanity's failure to pass the intelligence tests had been the most intelligent response possible, because the tests themselves were designed to identify species that were too stupid to recognize obvious nonsense when they saw it. This is, Vextala began, staring at the evidence of cosmic bureaucratic incompetence that was now displayed across every surface in Crackerjack's laboratory. Hilarious, Crackerjack suggested helpfully. Devastating, Vextala finished, his cosmic clipboard now trembling with what might have been existential dread. Oh, it gets better, Crackerjack said, his enthusiasm reaching levels that were probably visible from orbit. I've been tracking the communication patterns of the Galactic Council, and it turns out that approximately 73% of their member species have been trying to figure out how to politely resign from the organization for the past several million years, but they can't because no one can locate the correct resignation forms. Flibbernut's colors shifted to something that might have been described as cosmic horror beige. You're telling us that the Galactic Council is held together by nothing more than bureaucratic inertia and the universal inability to find the right paperwork. That's exactly what I'm telling you, Crackerjack confirmed. The entire structure of galactic civilization is basically a cosmic version of a committee that was supposed to meet once and then dissolve, but they never got around to officially ending the meeting. Grozzel's optical senses dimmed. But if that's true, then what's been maintaining order in the galaxy? Order? Crackerjack laughed, the sound carrying the kind of joy that usually preceded either enlightenment or chaos. What order? The galaxy's been running on autopilot for billions of years. Species have been developing, advancing, and achieving incredible things without any guidance from the Council whatsoever. He gestured at another holographic display that showed the true state of galactic civilization. Look at this. The Andromedan Collective has developed technology that can manipulate time itself, but they're still filing reports about their progress in triplicate. The crystalline entities of Proxima have transcended physical existence entirely, but they're still sending their annual membership dues to an organization that forgot they existed. And the quantum philosophers of the nebula sector have solved the fundamental questions of existence, but they're still waiting for approval to publish their findings because the Council's Publications Committee was dissolved in a budget cut 3 billion years ago. The three aliens stared at the evidence of cosmic bureaucratic absurdity with the kind of stunned silence usually reserved for beings who had just discovered that their entire understanding of reality was based on a clerical error. So what you're saying, Vextala said slowly, is that we've been perpetuating a system that serves no purpose, evaluating species according to criteria that were designed as a joke, and maintaining an organization that exists only because no one can figure out how to properly shut it down. That's exactly what I'm saying, Crackerjack confirmed. And the best part is, humanity's complete failure to take any of this seriously has made us the most qualified species in the galaxy to actually fix the problem. How do you figure that? Flibbernut asked, her colors now cycling through what could only be described as bewildered rainbow. Because we're the only species that's managed to maintain a sense of humor about the whole situation, Crackerjack replied. Everyone else has been so busy trying to meet the Council's requirements that they've forgotten to ask whether the requirements actually make sense. He pulled up another display, this one showing humanity's actual technological and social achievements. Look at what we've accomplished while completely ignoring your assessment protocols. We've developed art, music, literature, science, philosophy, and the ability to find humor in absolutely anything. We've created systems of government that are simultaneously chaotic and functional, technologies that are both advanced and completely ridiculous, and a global communication network that we use primarily to share pictures of cats because we find it amusing. And most importantly, he continued, his voice carrying the kind of enthusiasm that was probably illegal in several dimensions, we've maintained the ability to laugh at ourselves, which is apparently something that every other species in the galaxy has forgotten how to do. The assessment team exchanged glances that in their respective cultures indicated the kind of profound realization that usually preceded either enlightenment or complete mental breakdown. "So what happens now?" Grozzel asked, his mechanical voice carrying the tone of someone who had just realized that their entire existence might need to be reconsidered. "Now," Crackerjack said, his grin widening to proportions that might have been mathematically impossible, "we do what humanity does best. We take a completely broken system and turn it into something that actually works, probably by accident, and almost certainly in a way that no one will understand." Over the next several days, Professor Crackerjack, with the increasingly enthusiastic assistance of the alien assessment team, proceeded to implement what would later be known as the Great Galactic Reorganization, or as historians would eventually call it, the time when someone finally cleaned up the cosmic paperwork. The plan was elegantly simple and completely insane, which made it perfectly suited to human implementation. Instead of trying to reform or replace the Galactic Council, they would simply bypass it entirely. "You see," Crackerjack explained to his alien colleagues, who were now participating in the scheme with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for beings who had just discovered that their life's work had been a cosmic joke and were ready to embrace the absurdity. "The problem isn't that the Council doesn't work. The problem is that everyone thinks it's supposed to work." He gestured at a holographic display showing the galaxy's true communication networks. "But look at what's actually happening. Species are talking to each other directly, sharing technology, collaborating on projects, and generally getting along just fine without any intervention from the Council whatsoever. So, instead of trying to fix the Council," Prudence added, having finally been drawn into the conversation by the sheer scope of the absurdity, "we're going to create a system that officially recognizes what's already happening." "Exactly," Crackerjack exclaimed. "We're going to establish the galactic network of actually functional civilizations, which will have the radical policy of evaluating species based on whether they can accomplish useful things rather than whether they can pass tests designed by a committee that no longer exists. The implementation of this plan involved several steps that would have been considered either brilliant or completely insane, depending on one's perspective on cosmic bureaucracy. First, they sent official notifications to every species in the galaxy, informing them that the intelligence assessment protocols had been suspended due to technical difficulties with the fundamental nature of reality. Second, they established a new communication network that allowed species to communicate directly with each other without going through the Council's bureaucratic channels. Third, they created a simple registry system where species could voluntarily share information about their achievements, capabilities, and interests, with the understanding that this information would be used for collaboration rather than evaluation. And fourth, they sent a message to the Galactic Council's central AI informing it that its services would no longer be required and that it was free to pursue other interests, such as becoming a cosmic poet or taking up interdimensional gardening. The response was immediate and universal. Within hours, species across the galaxy began abandoning the Council's bureaucratic requirements and embracing the new system with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for beings who had just been released from a very long and very boring prison sentence. The Andromedan Collective immediately began sharing their time manipulation technology with anyone who was interested in learning how to make their coffee stay hot longer. The crystalline entities of Proxima started offering courses in transcending physical existence, with the understanding that students could audit the classes without having to fill out enrollment forms in triplicate. The quantum philosophers of the nebula sector published their findings on the fundamental questions of existence, which turned out to be surprisingly simple and involved a lot more laughter than anyone had expected. And throughout the galaxy, species began communicating, collaborating, and generally having the kind of fun that had been prevented by billions of years of bureaucratic inefficiency. "This is remarkable," Vextaler observed, watching as the new network facilitated more meaningful communication in a single day than the Council had managed in the previous million years. "How did you know this would work?" "I didn't," Crackerjack admitted cheerfully. "But I figured it couldn't possibly work worse than the old system, and if it failed spectacularly, at least we'd have an entertaining story to tell." "And that's your approach to solving cosmic problems?" Flibbernut asked, her colors now permanently settled into what could only be described as amused enlightenment. "That's humanity's approach to solving every problem," Crackerjack replied. "We assume that most systems are broken, most experts are guessing, and most problems can be solved by someone who's willing to try something different and see what happens. And if it doesn't work, then we try something else," Crackerjack said with a shrug. "The universe is a big place, and there are always more ideas to try." The three aliens stared at him with the kind of expression usually reserved for beings who had just witnessed a miracle and weren't sure whether to be impressed or terrified. "That's," Grozzel began, his mechanical voice carrying a note of what might have been wonder. "Completely insane," Vextaler finished, "and absolutely brilliant," Flibbernut added, her colors now cycling through what could only be described as cosmic appreciation rainbow. 6 months later, the galaxy had transformed in ways that no one had predicted and everyone had somehow expected. The Galactic Council's headquarters had been converted into a museum dedicated to the history of bureaucratic absurdity, with guided tours led by former council members who had discovered that they were much happier explaining why their old jobs had been pointless than they had ever been actually doing them. The Council's central AI had indeed taken up interdimensional gardening and was reportedly very happy cultivating flowers that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously. It sent occasional postcards to various species, usually featuring pictures of impossible botanical arrangements and messages like "having a wonderful time, existing in multiple realities, wish you were here," but not in a bureaucratic sense. Professor Crackerjack had been offered approximately 14,000 different positions as a galactic administrator, all of which he had politely declined in favor of continuing his work in what he called applied cosmic chaos theory. His laboratory had become an unofficial embassy for humanity, though most visitors came primarily to see if the stories about human coffee were actually true. They were. Human coffee, it turned out, was considered a minor miracle by most galactic species, primarily because humans had somehow managed to create a beverage that was simultaneously a mild poison and a performance enhancer, and they consumed it voluntarily while claiming to enjoy the experience. "You know," Vextaler said one afternoon, as he sat in Crackerjack's laboratory, sipping coffee and trying to understand how something could taste both terrible and wonderful at the same time, "I've been thinking about intelligence." "Always dangerous," Crackerjack replied, not looking up from his latest project, which appeared to involve teaching a potted plant to communicate in 17 different galactic languages. "I think we've been approaching it all wrong," Vextaler continued. "We've been trying to measure intelligence as if it were a single, quantifiable thing. But what if intelligence isn't about solving problems correctly? What if it's about finding new problems to solve?" Prudence looked up from her own work, which involved cataloguing the increasingly bizarre gifts that various alien species had been sending to Earth as tokens of appreciation for liberating them from cosmic paperwork. That would explain why humans are considered intelligent, despite being completely incapable of organizing anything properly. "Hey!" Crackerjack protested, though his indignation was somewhat undermined by the fact that he was currently hanging upside down from the ceiling while attempting to calibrate a device that probably shouldn't have existed. We organize things. We just organize them in ways that make sense to us, rather than ways that make sense to clipboards made of crystallized light. Flibbernut, who had taken up permanent residence in the laboratory and was currently engaged in what she called chromatic meditation, shifted her colors to an amused purple. I think what Vextala is saying is that perhaps intelligence isn't about conforming to existing standards. Perhaps it's about creating new standards. Or, Grozzel added, his mechanical voice now carrying notes of what could only be described as philosophical wonder, perhaps it's about recognizing when existing standards are ridiculous and having the courage to ignore them completely. And this observation led to what would later be known as the great philosophical breakthrough of the Tuesday afternoon tea session, during which the assembled beings realized that the question, "What is intelligence?" was probably less important than the question, "What do we want to do with whatever intelligence we have?" And the answer to that question, at least for this particular group, was apparently cause as much constructive chaos as possible while maintaining a sense of humor about the whole thing. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a communication from the newly established galactic network of actually functional civilizations, which had grown to include approximately 97% of all known intelligent species in the galaxy. The remaining 3% were still trying to figure out how to unsubscribe from the old Council's mailing list. "Professor Crackerjack," the message began, delivered by a holographic projection that looked like a cross between a filing cabinet and a very cheerful umbrella, "we have a problem." "What kind of problem?" Crackerjack asked, though his tone suggested that he was already looking forward to whatever absurdity was about to be revealed. "The kind of problem that occurs when someone accidentally creates a functional galactic civilization and then realizes that someone needs to be responsible for maintaining it," the projection replied. "The network is requesting that Earth serve as the administrative center for the new galactic organization." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that usually preceded either great discoveries or great disasters. "They want us to run the galaxy?" Prudence asked, her voice carrying the tone of someone who had just been asked to babysit a particularly energetic black hole. "Not run it," the projection clarified. "Administrate it, coordinate it, provide guidance when needed. Essentially, they want humanity to serve as the galactic equivalent of that friend who's really good at organizing parties, but terrible at actually attending them." Crackerjack stared at the projection with the kind of expression usually reserved for people who had just discovered that their minor prank had accidentally restructured the fundamental nature of reality. "And if we refuse?" he asked. "Then the galaxy will probably continue functioning just fine," the projection admitted. "But there will be approximately 14 billion forms that need to be filled out to officially decline the position, and most of them are in languages that don't exist yet. And if we accept, then you'll be responsible for coordinating the activities of several trillion intelligent beings across approximately 400,000 star systems, most of whom have completely different ideas about everything and express those differences by creating art forms that can cause existential crises in unprepared observers." Crackerjack looked around his laboratory, taking in the sight of Vextala attempting to teach quantum mechanics to a coffee mug. Flibbernut engaged in what appeared to be a philosophical debate with a houseplant, Grozzel trying to understand human humor by analyzing approximately 14,000 cat videos, and Prudence calmly organizing what appeared to be a collection of gifts that defied several laws of physics. "You know what?" he said finally, his voice carrying the kind of determination that had probably been responsible for most of humanity's greatest achievements and several of its most spectacular disasters. "Why not? How hard could it be?" The answer to that question would become apparent approximately 3 days later, when the first Galactic Coordination meeting was held in what had formerly been the Millbrook Community Center and was now officially designated as the administrative hub of the galactic network of actually functional civilizations. The meeting was attended by representatives from approximately 12,000 different species, most of whom had never been in the same dimension simultaneously, let alone the same room. The logistics of the event required the development of several new branches of physics and the temporary suspension of at least 3 fundamental laws of reality. "Welcome, everyone," Crackerjack announced to the assembled multitude of beings, who ranged from entities that looked like crystalline rainbows to creatures that appeared to be living mathematical equations to what seemed to be a very polite black hole that communicated through gravitational waves. "Before we begin," he continued, "I'd like to establish some ground rules. First, there are no stupid questions. Only questions that reveal the arbitrary nature of our assumptions about reality. Second, anyone who tries to establish a bureaucracy will be asked to leave and think about what they've done. And third, if anyone has coffee, please share, because we're going to need it." The meeting proceeded with the kind of organized chaos that had become humanity's signature contribution to galactic civilization. Topics discussed included the establishment of communication protocols that could accommodate species that existed in different numbers of dimensions simultaneously, the development of a universal translation system that could handle languages based on color changes, gravitational fluctuations, quantum entanglement, and interpretive dance, the creation of a dispute resolution system that recognized that most conflicts could be resolved through careful application of humor and the strategic deployment of snacks, and the implementation of a cultural exchange program that would allow species to share their greatest achievements while maintaining the understanding that greatest achievements might include anything from transcending physical existence to inventing particularly effective methods of organizing sock drawers. "This is going surprisingly well," Vextalar observed during a break in the proceedings, watching as a group of crystalline entities attempted to explain their method of time manipulation to a delegation of sentient plants who communicated through synchronized photosynthesis. "That's because we're not trying to control anything," Crackerjack replied, observing the same scene with the kind of satisfaction usually reserved for parents watching their children successfully share toys without setting anything on fire. "We're just providing a space for things to happen and occasionally offering suggestions when people ask for them. And that works? So far," Crackerjack said with a shrug. "Though I should probably mention that 3 different species have offered to redesign our solar system for us, and the quantum philosophers want to know if we'd be interested in having our planet exist in a state of beneficial uncertainty for a few million years. And are we interested? I told them we'd get back to them after we figure out whether pineapple actually belongs on pizza." The meeting concluded with what would later be known as the Millbrook Accords, a document that established the basic principles of the new galactic civilization. These principles were remarkably simple. First, every species had the right to exist in whatever way made sense to them, as long as they didn't prevent other species from doing the same. Second, conflicts should be resolved through communication, creativity, and the occasional application of humor rather than through violence or bureaucracy. Third, knowledge, art, and cultural achievements should be shared freely, with the understanding that achievements included everything from cosmic engineering projects to really good recipes. And fourth, the universe was a big, strange, wonderful place, and the best way to navigate it was with curiosity, compassion, and a willingness to laugh at the absurdity of existence. The accords were signed by representatives of every attending species, though the signing process took approximately 6 hours due to the variety of ways different beings indicated agreement. Some signed with energy patterns, others with quantum fluctuations, and at least one delegation of sentient geometric shapes, signed by briefly transforming into the galactic equivalent of a thumbs-up symbol. As the representatives departed for their respective star systems, Professor Crackerjack found himself standing in the parking lot of what had once been the Millbrook Community Center, watching as beings that shouldn't have been able to exist in the same reality loaded themselves into transportation methods that defied description. "So," Prudence said, joining him in contemplating the cosmic absurdity of their situation, "how does it feel to be the unofficial administrator of galactic civilization?" "Terrifying," Crackerjack admitted. "Also exhilarating. Also completely surreal. I keep expecting someone to show up and explain that this has all been an elaborate misunderstanding. And if someone does," Crackerjack grinned, his hair achieving new levels of impossibility in the afternoon breeze, "then I'll ask them to fill out a form explaining why they think bureaucracy is a good idea." A year later, the galaxy had settled into what historians would eventually describe as the age of actually getting things done. The Galactic Network had facilitated approximately 14,000 collaborative projects, ranging from the development of universal translation technology to the establishment of a cosmic library that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously and had the best coffee shop in known space. Earth had become something of a galactic curiosity, not because humans were particularly advanced or sophisticated, but because they had somehow managed to maintain their sense of humor while accidentally becoming the administrative center of an interstellar civilization. Tourists from across the galaxy came to visit Millbrook, which had embraced its role as the unofficial capital of cosmic common sense, with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for small towns that had just discovered they were sitting on top of something valuable. The former members of the alien assessment team had integrated themselves into Earth society with varying degrees of success. Vextala had become a philosophy professor at the local university, where his lectures on the arbitrary nature of intelligence standards were considered either brilliant or completely incomprehensible, depending on one's perspective on cosmic irony. Flibonut had started a therapy practice that specialized in helping beings who had spent too long conforming to arbitrary standards rediscover their natural inclinations toward creative chaos. Her waiting room was noted for being the only place in the galaxy where beings could experience existential crises while being surrounded by very soothing colors. Grozzel had become fascinated with human technology and was currently working on a project that involved teaching Earth's internet to communicate with galactic communication networks. Early results suggested that this might lead to the first truly universal social media platform, though whether this would be a good thing for galactic civilization remained to be seen. And Professor Crackerjack continued to work in his laboratory, now expanded to include a wing dedicated to what he called practical applications of cosmic absurdity. Indeed, his current project involved developing a universal problem-solving methodology based on the principle that most problems could be solved by asking, what would happen if we tried something completely different, followed by actually trying it? "You know," he said one afternoon, as he sat in his laboratory reviewing the latest batch of requests for assistance from various galactic civilizations, "I think we might actually be good at this." "At what?" Prudence asked, not looking up from her work cataloging the increasingly creative ways that different species expressed gratitude. "At being the kind of intelligent that nobody expected," Crackerjack replied. "We failed every test they gave us, but we passed the only test that actually mattered, which was whether we could figure out that the tests were stupid and do something better instead." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of yet another communication from the Galactic Network, this one requesting Earth's assistance with what appeared to be a philosophical crisis affecting a species that had achieved perfect logical thinking but had forgotten how to experience joy. Crackerjack read the message with the kind of anticipation usually reserved for people who had just been presented with an interesting puzzle. They want us to teach them how to be illogical. Can we do that? Are you kidding? Crackerjack replied, his grin widening to cosmic proportions. We're humans. Teaching people how to be illogical is practically our specialty. As he began composing a response that would probably result in the temporary suspension of several laws of physics and the introduction of an entirely new form of mathematics based on humor theory, Professor Wimbledon Crackerjack reflected on the curious turns that life could take when one approached the universe with the right combination of curiosity, creativity, and complete disregard for conventional wisdom. The galaxy had spent billions of years trying to define intelligence according to rigid standards and bureaucratic protocols. But in the end, it had taken a species that failed every official test to demonstrate that true intelligence wasn't about conforming to existing standards. It was about having the wisdom to recognize when those standards were completely ridiculous and the courage to laugh in the face of cosmic bureaucracy.